Come to order. Welcome to the first hearing of the Cyber Information Technology and Innovation Subcommittee in the 118th Congress. I'm thrilled to lead this subcommittee with my friend and colleague, Representative Ro Khanna, who's going to be joining us in about 30 minutes. I believe it's his wife's birthday. That's more important. But I've worked very productively with Ro for 6 years, and I would like to enter into the record an op-ed that Representative Khanna and I wrote together as freshman members of Congress. The piece focuses on congressional reform, not defense, but it demonstrates that we've long been willing to work across party lines to modernize this institution. And while Ro is a progressive and I'm a conservative, we both like to think for ourselves, and we both believe that the Department of Defense can do better when it comes to innovation. In my opinion, the only way to truly win World War III is to prevent it. And if we accept the slow, bureaucratic status quo, deterrence will fail again, as it failed in Ukraine. And on this subcommittee, I'd like us to dedicate ourselves to the question of how we deter war. There are three questions in particular I think we need to answer. First, is the Pentagon prepared for an invasion of Taiwan that has already begun in cyberspace? Second, what technologies are most important for winning a future war, and what are the barriers to the department rapidly adopting such technologies, particularly commercial technologies? And third, are the services in the Pentagon sensibly structured and resourced to recruit, train, and maintain and equip cyber warriors? As we work to deter war, time is not on our side. It's taken me 6 years to get this gavel, and I intend to wield it against the forces of darkness that waste our time, which is our most precious resource. So behind me, you'll see a picture of the clock at Lambeau Field, which is always set 15 minutes early to reflect, set 15 minutes fast to reflect Vince Lombardi's wisdom that if you're on time, you're 15 minutes late. This committee will operate with the Lombardi time principle in mind. And to this end, I've developed the 3 city commandments, which you'll see on the other side here, on this side behind me. First, we'll start on time. We passed our first test. Thank you to Representative Moulton for being here on time. And since I have to be here the whole time anyways, I may just yield my initial question time to punctual members like Ms. McClain, who is here on double Lombardi time, 30 minutes early. Second, 5 minutes shall be 5 minutes. I've gained a profound respect for former chairman, now ranking member Adam Smith's ability to enforce the 5-minute timeline. That being said, if you stick around until the end, I'm always more than happy to entertain a second round of questions. And third, to the extent possible, let's not use acronyms or jargon. The Pentagon suffers from a disease called acronymphomania, a fetishistic use of acronyms that clouds clear thinking. And on this subcommittee, let's please try to communicate in simple and direct language that normal Americans can understand. So in the spirit of these 3 commandments, and in the hope that this is the longest speech I will ever give on the subcommittee, I will stop talking and yield to Representative Moulton, who did phenomenal work chairing the Future of Defense Task Force and has long been a leading voice for innovation in the defense enterprise. Mr. Moulton.
Thank you, Mike. General C.Q. Brown, Chief of Staff of the Air Force, has written and said many times over the last several years, accelerate change or lose. And that really is what's at stake here. If we do not change more quickly to modernize our ability to conduct warfare, we will lose. By many measures, we're losing to our adversaries already, who are modernizing much more quickly than we are. So we have a lot of work to do to catch up, so that the ultimate goal, as Mr. Gallagher so well articulated, is achieved, which is preventing war, deterring war, showing our adversaries that we will beat them if they try. So we have a lot of work to do, and it's an honor to be back on this subcommittee. We have some excellent witnesses here today, some of the best of the best. So let me turn it over to all of you, and Mr. Gallagher, thank you very much, and congratulations on making it here after 6 years.
Thank you. As Representative Moulton said, we have a phenomenal panel of witnesses joining us today. We have Mr. Chris Brose, who is the Chief Strategy Officer of Anduril Industries and author of an incredible book called Kill Chain, Defending America in the Future of High-Tech Warfare, which I commend to all of you. Prior to his current role, Mr. Brose served as Senior Policy Advisor to Senator John McCain and later Staff Director of the Senate Armed Services Committee. We also have Admiral Mark Montgomery, who is the Senior Director of the Center on Cyber and Technology Innovation at the Foundation for Defensive Democracies. He served in the U.S. Navy for 32 years, holding posts as Director for Operations at U.S. Pacific Command and Commander of Carrier Strike Group 5. Admiral Montgomery served as the Executive Director of the Cyberspace Solarium Commission, which I co-chaired with Senator Angus King, and it was a pleasure to work with him. And we also have Mr. Peter Singer, who's currently a strategist at New America and founder and managing partner at Useful Fiction, LLC. He served as a consultant for the U.S. military and intelligence community, was coordinator for the Obama campaign's Defense Policy Task Force, and is a prolific writer on futuristic national security issues, including having written one of my favorite books of all time, Ghost Fleet. Burn-In is also exceptional. I'm waiting for the movie versions of these books, Mr. Singer. And I believe has more books on professional reading lists than any other author alive, military professional reading lists than any other author alive or dead. So with that, I will turn it over to Mr. Brose for his testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the subcommittee. It's an honor to have the opportunity to testify before you today on the future of warfare. Often when this topic is discussed in U.S. defense circles, it's treated as a future problem, something coming in the 2030s or 40s, something we have time to get ready for. This, I would contend, is dangerously wrong. The future of warfare is here, and America is largely being ambushed by it. The U.S. military and our way of war are being disrupted. Our idea of national defense is largely based on the ability to project military power across the globe using small numbers of large, expensive, exquisite, heavily manned and hard to replace ships, aircraft, and other platforms. The Chinese Communist Party knows this, and it has been working diligently and with regrettable competence to be able to not just degrade and destroy America's small number of large, expensive military things, but to render U.S. forces deaf, dumb, and blind and unable to fight. At the same time, our defense enterprise is also being disrupted by new technologies, such as artificial intelligence, autonomous systems, robotics, ubiquitous sensors, and low-cost access to space. Technologies such as these are changing the character of war, and this too is happening now. In the recent Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, in the continued fighting in the Middle East, and in the ongoing war in Ukraine, we are seeing how low-cost robotic vehicles, AI-enabled loitering munitions, digital targeting systems, cyber weapons, persistent communications and surveillance satellites, and other advanced capabilities, especially when paired with large volumes of more traditional weapons, are transforming warfare. Some lessons are emerging from this recent experience. On the current and future battlefield, moving and communicating is highly contested. Hiding is nearly impossible. And once detected, surviving is just as difficult. This means that a correctly armed and ready defender can make life hell for militaries that have optimized for long-distance power projection and offensive operations, militaries such as our own. These dual disruptions of threat and technology have been underway for years, but for many reasons, having largely to do with our own politics and bureaucracy, the United States has been too slow to respond. As a result, we are entering what the chairman has called the window of maximum danger, a period over the coming years when the Chinese Communist Party, feeling undeterred by the U.S. military, may seek to remake the status quo in the Asia-Pacific region through force, for instance, by invading Taiwan. None of us wants that to happen, nor can we predict whether it will. All we can do is ensure that we are ready if, God forbid, deterrence fails and U.S. forces are called to maintain the peace. This responsibility falls most heavily to you and your colleagues in the 118th Congress. Nothing you do in this Congress will make larger numbers of traditional ships, aircraft, and other platforms materialize over the next several years. It is possible, however, to generate an arsenal of alternative military capabilities that could be delivered to U.S. forces in large enough quantities within the next few years to make a decisive difference. Those decisions could all be taken by this Congress. The goal would be to rapidly field what I have referred to as a Moneyball military, one that is achievable, affordable, and capable of winning. Such a military would be composed not of small quantities of large, exquisite, expensive things, but rather by large quantities of smaller, lower cost, more autonomous, consumable things, and most importantly, the digital means of integrating them. These kinds of alternative capabilities exist now, or could be rapidly matured and fielded in massive quantities within the window of maximum danger. You could set this in motion in the next 2 years. The goal would be more about defense than offense, more about countering power projection than projecting power ourselves. It would be to demonstrate that the United States, together with our allies and partners, could do to a Chinese invasion or a Chinese offensive what the Ukrainians, with our support, have thus far been able to do to their Russian invaders: degrade and deny the ability of a great power to accomplish its objectives through violence, and in so doing, to prevent that future war from ever happening. After all, this is all about deterrence. All of this is possible. We have sufficient money, technology, authorities, and we still have enough time, if we are serious. If we make better decisions now, we can push this looming period of vulnerability further into the future, and this will mostly be up to you. For if these decisions are left even to the next Congress, they may be too late. Thank you very much.
Well within the 5 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Brose. Admiral Montgomery.
Chairman Gallagher, Ranking Member Moulton, other members of the subcommittee, thanks for inviting me here today. I mean, to answer the basic question, are we ready? I'm afraid that, like Chris, I believe that unless we make substantive changes to how we develop and procure weapons and how we embrace emerging technologies, the United States will not be ready to deter and defeat China in the demanding technological environment we're going to face in the next 5 years. The U.S. relies heavily on precision-guided munitions, the ability to conduct large-scale mobility and sustainment ops, and extensive intelligence collection capabilities to deter and defeat adversaries. But the Chinese have spent the last 25 years working this problem, investing in asymmetric weapons and sensor systems, using emerging technologies to neutralize America's operational superiority. And they've reduced the ability of U.S. forces to rapidly detect, track, and kill the adversary. The Chinese now have a military force designed to place U.S. air and naval forces at risk within the first island chain, and the Chinese may soon have the same impact on U.S. forces within the second island chain. While U.S. military leaders have talked about China as the pacing threat, the Chinese have procured weapons as if the United States was their pacing threat. So not surprisingly, Chinese action has outperformed American rhetoric. But despite these challenges, the U.S. can flip the script, and if we make the right investments to retain our military technological advantage, we can overcome China's asymmetric advantages. I would just say outside of city's jurisdiction, but inside HASC, there's a few things we could do right away. We could increase procurement of long-range weapons to strike Chinese ships. We could develop and deploy cruise, ballistic, and hypersonic defense capabilities throughout the Pacific. We could pre-position munitions in Taiwan for Taiwan's use in a contingency, because we're not going to be able to resupply them like we do Ukraine. And we could actually train and exercise with the Taiwan Air and Maritime Forces in theater, as we do with every other ally and partner. All of these actions will increase deterrence, and if a war comes, improve the chances of U.S. victory and drive down U.S. casualties. And we can do this only using a fraction of the current defense budget. Within the city subcommittee, there are equally important steps that can be taken to ensure U.S. forces are ready. First, we can improve the cyber resilience of the military and the nation. In a conflict with China, our forces need to be able to maintain our ability to detect and track the adversaries, to communicate among units, and mobilize and sustain forces in the field. To ensure this connectivity, the U.S. military needs to invest in better resilience and redundancy across every node and operational link. And I think this effort has to extend into our national critical infrastructure. The resilience of the transportation, electrical power, water, financial systems that enable the mobilization and resupply of U.S. forces has to improve. The second thing this subcommittee can do is assess and strengthen the readiness and structure of U.S. cyber forces. U.S. cyber forces are really inconsistent in their organization, readiness, and training across the various military services. And the size of each military service's contribution to the cyber mission has not changed appreciably since the original agreements in 2010, despite significant changes in the threat from China and Russia. Really, this subcommittee has got to figure out if the current design of the cyber mission force is what we need for the 21st century, or should we be considering an independent cyber force, as was recently done with the Space Force? The third thing this subcommittee ought to be pushing is an environment to innovate. The U.S. has learned some really important lessons from the conflict in Ukraine. For example, the Ukrainians needed anti-ship cruise missiles to limit Russian naval operations in the Black Sea, but there was no program of record available for land-based Harpoon missile launching system. So the Ukrainians worked with Boeing, the Danish Army, and the U.S. Navy to MacGyver together a launcher system. And they did this in 2 months. But Taiwan was approved for a similar land-based Harpoon system in 2020, and they've been told delivery of the new design system will be 2027 or 2028. Clearly, we could do a similar MacGyver approach, and we should do that with Boeing and the Navy to ensure that our key partner, Taiwan, has the weapon systems it needs to deter Chinese action sooner than 7 or 8 years after they ordered it. Finally, this committee could ensure that the U.S. works with our allies to maintain interoperability with U.S. forces. We have a problem when we modernize software and technology systems. We often create gaps that lead to challenges conducting coalition operations. I think we have to be particularly aware of this as we develop and field and I'll use an acronym here, JADC2 architecture. So in conclusion, what I would say is that the U.S. may not be on the right track today for a conflict with China, but we can make some smart investments now to get back on track. And this subcommittee can help make that so.
Thank you. You can use an acronym. You have to spell it out first. Joint All-Domain Command and Control. But thank you. Mr. Singer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members, for the opportunity to speak to this important hearing. As with the other witnesses, my testimony today represents my personal opinion, not the official position of any organization I've worked with. You asked us whether the Pentagon is prepared to deter and defeat America's adversaries. A valuable approach to answering your question is to ask a question in turn. What would a yes look like in the future? We can then work backward and explore both the elements of such a potential future successful history and how we can build towards them today. One methodology for this cross of strategy and scenario is the deliberate blend of nonfiction research and analysis with narrative. Known as ficant or useful fiction, the goal is to share the facts of new trends and technologies, but in a scenario format that the science of the brain shows is more likely to lead to both understanding and action. I've entered into the record such a scenario crafted for this committee entitled, "What Would Winning Look Like?" Told from the perspective of an imagined PLA officer in the future, it envisions a positive outcome for the hearing's question and the central problem for U.S. defense planning, a future world in which the United States has successfully deterred the PLA from attacking Taiwan. While I hope you take the time to engage with and even enjoy the narrative, today I'd like to share with you some of the policy findings of it. The key elements of a winning outcome for the U.S. military in the future of war would include that we, 1, enact regular, open-ended war games designed to truly test and learn. 2, avoid letting political and bureaucratic inertia and the mentality of sunk costs drive acquisitions. 3, foster a dynamic defense marketplace where the military can engage with and easily purchase from both big and small firms. 4, scale innovation hubs and experimental task forces such that every command has access to rapid means of learning and implementation. And we should also replicate the current Shark Tank contests in some portions of the force across it to reward bottom-up proposals and fixes from junior troops. 5, acquire a new generation of unmanned systems across all domains, but avoid unmanned systems that simply replicate the expensive manned systems that they're replacing. 6, develop new doctrines to take advantage of robotics' unique attributes, allowing swarming and cheap high-risk uses. 7, prepare for certain adversary use with counter-drone systems of kinetic, EW, and directed energy. 8, invest in AI and quantum technology to match its growing civilian importance. 9, reform U.S. military networks to create a federated model of mesh data to take advantage of the benefits of AI. 10, ensure that the U.S. military is able to retain its professionalism while evolving to reflect the new America that it both draws upon and protects. 11, scale new U.S. military units able to operate across multi-domains, rapidly deploying networks of small teams, each able to operate independently, yet generate disproportionate kinetic and non-kinetic effects against major systems. 12, transform special operations forces into blended teams of technical experts and elite soldiers, able to provide a more comprehensive full continuum of uses. 13, create redundancies in scale and space through fleets of microsats and cheap launch systems. 14, bake security into the emerging Internet of Things through requirements and regulation so as to limit physical damage from digital threats. 15, utilize cyber and diplomatic means to repeatedly out covert campaigns designed to undermine democracies. 16, engage in persistent competition on the info, economic, political, and cyber fronts to create greater friction for the PLA and CCP. 17, provide Taiwan distributed anti-air weapons and unmanned systems to take away adversary quantitative advantage, and most especially cheap, rapidly deployable smart mines to block essential seaways. 18, aid efforts to create a Taiwanese society prepared for resistance, especially in urban settings, and by mirroring its digital systems outside the country. 19, bolster multilateral ties between states that have worsening bilateral ties with China. And finally, 20th, secure Russia's defeat in Ukraine, both to weaken it and its allies, as well as provide a model of success for other democracies under threat. In closing, I hope you find both the lessons and the approach useful as a means to stoke healthy discussion about the future of war through envisioning a successful outcome of the committee's work.
Thank you. Before we go to questions, I ask unanimous consent to enter Ranking Member Khanna's opening statement and our joint op-ed into the record. I think it just happens like that. Look at that. Without objection. So ordered. Okay. Hey, I'm learning. With great power comes great responsibility. I know Ms. McLean has to go to another hearing and was here earlier than anyone else, so I will recognize her for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here today. I really appreciate it. I come from the business sector, so this is new to me, but I try and apply a lot of the same concepts and principles that work in private sector. And I realize government isn't the same as the private sector, but it doesn't mean that we necessarily shouldn't adopt some of the same concepts. So with that said, obviously for the past several years, we've seen that the United States has had significant shortcomings in cyber defense. From January 2020 to February 22, Russian state-sponsored actors hacked numerous defense contractors. May 21, the Colonial Pipeline was a victim of ransomware. In June 22, the FBI National Security Agency and CISA announced that Chinese state-sponsored hacker targeted and breached major telecommunication companies, et cetera, we could go on and on, right? Mr. Singer, you asked a very prudent question in your testimony when you talked about what would winning look like. I'd like you to expand on that. And then the second thing is you gave us 20 ideas, which are wonderful. But in all reality, if we can do one, that would probably be an accomplishment. So let's talk a minute about, in your opinion, what would winning look like?
Thank you for the question. I think to break it down in particular on the area that you're interested in terms of business practices and cybersecurity, let's imagine a future Internet of Things, because we have a core change happening from using the Internet for communication to operating our systems. What would we like it to look like to be both deliver what we need, but also secure? And a big problem right now is that we are repeating the mistakes that we made in the original design and lack of regulation for the internet. That is,
so, and I don't mean to keep interrupting, but I only have like 2 minutes.
Yeah, go for it.
3 minutes.
What winning would look like would be a secure
So it's
internet
regulation?
It would be in part regulation towards greater design security for Internet of Things systems, much like the approach that has been taken within the defense economy. We have parts of regulation of other aspects of critical infrastructure, but it's very spotty. So for example, banking cybersecurity is great right now, energy, water systems, not.
So what's interesting to me is from the private sector, and I'm going to tie the two together, is, you know, we have to have a cyber defense officer, and if a business owner gets hacked, we pay a consequence. We are held accountable, right, to our own dime at our own expense. Can you speak to the lack of accountability or consequence? Do you think that plays a role?
Very much so, yes. We have unclear accountability, and the result is, for the most part, the costs fall upon the victim.
What would you say the accountability is. Because from my situation as an outsider looking in and from a lot of my constituents, it seems like the answer to that accountability is just throw more money at the problem. And until we get to the root cause of what these issues are, it's like throwing mud at the wall. What, in your opinion, are the root causes of all of these failures? There might be 20 of them, but give me the one that if we could fix fix this one, it would give us the biggest bang for our buck.
I think I would agree with actually my colleague, Mr. Brose. If we could get most bang for the buck right now in terms of future of war, it would be greater numbers of small unmanned systems and smart mines that would be able to deliver a greater defense to allies under threat like Taiwan.
And in your opinion, why don't we do that? Meaning, is it a priority? Is it a lack of funds? Is it accountability? Is it talent? Is it why don't we do it?
I think it's a combination of the sunk cost mentality. They aren't old programs. They would require new programs. Secondly, many of these systems, the profit margins aren't great unless you buy them in scale. And bluntly, the defense economy right now doesn't trust the military to buy small, cheap systems in scale. Finally, many of them are not bluntly sexy. Sea mines is, on one hand, been most lethal to U.S. Navy ships, but they're not the kind that you get great promotions from.
Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Moulton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. When we co-chaired, Mr. Banks and I, the Future Defense Task Force, a couple of the interesting conclusions we came to is that essential to deterring and winning future conflicts is not just modernizing our military, that's pretty obvious, but also developing a next generation or a new generation of alliances and arms control. And I'd like to focus on those for a second. We've seen how important the NATO alliance has been for decades of deterrence in Europe, and now winning the war in Ukraine. But we don't have a NATO alliance or a NATO-like alliance in the Pacific, which is of great concern as we look at the rise of China. Likewise, arms control has been effective at both deterring and putting us in a position to win future conflicts. The deterrence piece is probably pretty obvious. If you have well-balanced deterrence on both sides, a comparable number of nuclear capabilities between the United States and Russia, for example, you're less likely to get into a conflict. And obviously, by reducing arms overall, we try to reduce the likelihood of conflict to begin with. We don't often think about the role that smart arms control can also play in setting us up to win a future conflict. If we limit the number of nuclear warheads that either side has, but ours are much more accurate, then we are giving ourselves an advantage. Can you speak for a minute to the role of arms control in preparing us to better deter and win a fight with AI-enabled systems? Because we have a lot of nuclear arms control. We haven't even discussed arms control when it comes to AI. Mr. Brose, perhaps we'll start with you.
So I think the problem is less about arms control at the moment. I think it's more about actual arms generation. You know, I think the reason...
I understand that, but I'd just like to focus on the arms control piece, because here's my concern. If there are no rules for the use of AI, we are going to still constrain ourselves by our values, but our adversaries may not, which gives them an inherent advantage. So how do we counter that?
I think it really comes down to developing these types of capabilities with our values at the core of them. And I think a lot of times in the past where we've developed technologies, remotely piloted aircraft, we've made the mistake of being overly secretive about how we're thinking about them, how we're building them, how we're using them. I actually think in the development of these technologies, being more transparent about the challenges, the brittleness, the ways in which we are building these and developing and fielding these technologies with our values at the core of them, will provide us the moral high ground. It will give us greater leverage and greater kind of public standing to make demands of others, primarily countries that don't share our values. I guess the thing that I would just underscore is, even if we do all of that, I'm not terribly confident that they're going to follow suit. I think at the end of the day, this becomes something where we have to have the capability such that there's even something to be able to discuss. I think you've already agreed with that.
Yeah, of course. Admiral Montgomery, do you have any comments on this?
So I think where we're looking at this closest now is what kind of agreement, what kind of way, how do we proceed with man in the loop, man on the loop, and man out of the loop, that as you bring AI technology into our unmanned craft, and how do we talk to the Russians and Chinese about it? I think it's fine to talk to them. In cybersecurity, we looked at this and we found that there was just no way to verify, and therefore it became very hard to trust our discussions with the Russians that we had on this. And what I would say is we operate with man in the loop. We design systems to man on the loop. We probably need to design systems to man out of the loop, have that capability and capacity, so that if we understand that our adversaries are operating man out of the loop, we're able to do it. Because the OODA loop, not to use another acronym, but the decision-making cycle for man out of the loop is so much faster than on the loop and in the loop, that if we have not developed those weapon systems and sensor systems, we will not succeed.
Mr. Singh, we're running out of time, but I'd appreciate your comments for the record on this. I want to get to another question quickly. Admiral Montgomery brought up the idea of having an independent cyber command. Mr. Brose, do you think that that is a good idea?
An independent cyber service, I think it is definitely something that needs to be looked at. I think that the reasons that the Congress led the creation of the Space Force are just as prevalent, if not more, inside of the cyber capabilities and the cyber services. It's definitely something that needs to be seriously considered.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. And before I recognize one of our members for a question, I want to recognize that the ranking member, Mr. Khanna, has showed up. And I know it was his wife's birthday, so I've gotten her a birthday present for you to open. I'm sure it's exactly what she wanted. And feel free to open it as we ask questions, but we're glad.
I thought I was in trouble, Mr. Chair, for being non-punctual, but you had advance notice.
You work with us, and Mr. Moulton covered you very well, so thank you, Mr. Moulton. Now I'm going to recognize one of our new members, Congressman Lalota from Long Island, who is a U.S. Naval Academy grad, a surface warfare officer who's deployed to 20 countries, and most importantly, his brother is a Marine sniper. Is that correct? Great. Well, we're very excited to have your wealth of experience on the committee. I now recognize you for 5 minutes.
Thanks, Chairman, and thanks for hosting this very important meeting on this topic. And to you, gentlemen, we appreciate your insight, your expertise, but more than anything else, your dedication. This is a very important warfare area to help defeat and deter our nation's adversaries. Very much appreciate that insight. Admiral, appreciate your service. I read that you were a SWO as well, so and Mr. DeLuzio on the other side, who's going to return to us as well, has our common background too. So it'd be nice to have a chat with you. But specifically, and to you, Admiral, in looking at the readiness of the cyber mission force, how far back does this issue go? Has it improved since the cyber mission forces marked full operational capability in 2018, Admiral?
Thanks. That's a great question, because really, to the best of my knowledge, readiness has been and remains a problem for the cyber mission force. Before reaching FOC, full operational capability, we kind of all had a widespread belief that once they reached, the CMF got there, they would then burn down the readiness problem over the years. They would only get better. Well, that's not happened. We reached FOC almost 5 years ago, and we know that assumption didn't pan out. Readiness today is relatively the same as it was. So now people come to us and say, well, look, it's really about metrics. If you just understood, it's hard to do metrics in cyberspace, and the metrics are wrong. I don't agree with that. I think Cyber Command under Admiral Rogers and then General Nakasone has absolutely laid out some good cyber metrics. And the truth is the services aren't meeting them. It's not always a priority. It's sometimes a priority, not always a priority. And when you don't prioritize cyber, the train, maintain, equip functions, it won't function. And really, it's unreasonable to believe that pursuing the same course of action for a 6th year in a row is going to get us healthier.
I appreciate that, Admiral. My second and last question is for Mr. Brose, sir. In hearing your testimony, it reminds me of the wise words of our Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Gilday, get real, get better. And I especially appreciated your Moneyball analogy. You also mentioned in your testimony how technologies are changing, the characters of war, the technologies such as AI, our autonomous systems and robotics. And my question is, how would you suggest that we best integrate these new technologies with our current and traditional weapons? And if you have enough time, would you recommend prioritizing these new technologies over traditional weapon systems?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think when it comes to the integration, much of that is going to be a software problem. This is a solvable problem. Modern software is more than capable of figuring out how to, pass information to and receive information from military systems. In terms of integrating from more of an operational and organizational perspective, I don't think we've even begun to scratch the surface of that. And I think the problem is because we don't actually have enough of these capabilities to even begin to wrestle with the kind of question that you're posing. So I guess my contention would be, first and foremost, we have to start fielding these types of systems that are absolutely available now. We're not talking about, photon torpedoes and cloaking devices. The challenge is, I think, in the government, we tend to make the easy problems so hard that we never actually get to the hard problems, which are the ones that you're asking, which is how are we actually going to organize ourselves and fight with these different kinds of capabilities, primarily autonomous systems.
Can I jump in on that for 1 second? I have to tell you, one of the issues is that the services do not procure munitions in the right level. So as we develop a new system, and I'll give you one good example, something called the long-range anti-ship cruise missile. Every war game I play about a dozen a year as the Blue Force commander. We need about 1,200. We'll say 1,000 or 1,200. These are unclassified war games. The Navy and Air Force have 240 right now. We're building, the Defense Department's input every year has been 38 to 50. Congress has bumped it up to 75. If you do the math on that, the department won't.
I recognize my first boss in the Marine Corps, Bert Steele, is in the audience. I just did a double take. So if you need any compromise about a young, precocious Second Lieutenant Gallagher, he's right there. How are you, sir? I'm now thrilled to recognize another new member of the committee with an incredible background, another New Yorker, Pat Ryan, who is a West Point grad, a Georgetown grad, 2 tours in Iraq, worked at Palantir, a wealth of experience. You're recognized for 5 minutes, Mr. Ryan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and it's an honor to be on the committee with all of you all, and really, really appreciate you taking the time and your insights. One question, and I ask you to really try to push on this to your Moneyball approach, which I love, Mr. Brose. What should we get rid of? We always talk about what we should add. To push you all a little bit, can you think of 1 or 2 maybe legacy programs or anything that comes to your mind? I know it's a controversial question, but we never ask it. What, even a smaller thing that we could get rid of to help free up dollars and energy and resources for, I think, the good recommendations you're making? Mr. Brose, start with you.
I think there's plenty of opportunities to take a look at. I think there's force structure that we need to consider in terms of the number of people, how large the services are going to need to be, because at the end of the day, people tend to be the most expensive investment in the department. I think there are a lot of legacy systems in terms of surface combatants in the Navy, sort of infantry fighting vehicles in the Army, 4th-generation fighter aircraft that don't have the legs or the signature to be able to do the kinds of things that we would have to do in a high-end fight. But here, too, I think the challenge is I would focus more on the things that we need to start to get into the hands of our operators, because unless you start to give people new tools, I would not be in favor of taking the tools that they have away from them. And I think that tends to be the challenge here, which is we focus on the things we need to cut, which is totally something we need to do. The problem is that the future never shows up. The new things never show up, so people can be forgiven for wanting to hold on to the things that they have.
I do agree with Chris Brose that we have to look at troop levels. I think the Army has settled out around 450,000. We ought to keep them there. There was a Future of the Army study in 2016 where the Army said they needed to be 450,000. They don't like to discuss that in public, but that's the history of it. The second thing I would do is adopt what Commandant Berger said when he first took over the Marine Corps, which is reduce large amphibious ships from 31 down to 21 and add in light amphibious warfare ships laws. He said since been dragged off of that by retired Marine Corps generals and shipbuilding interests. But the reality is amphibious ships are not a priority in a conflict in China. I wrote our war plans for 4 years. I wrote our war plans for Europe for 2 years. They're not a priority there. They are a priority for Korea. Korea is not our #1 priority. So if you're going to have to deprioritize something, I'd take that down. And I would do everything else Commandant Berger said in his reimagining of the Marine Corps, because it was fantastic. I wouldn't, as a Navy officer, I would say I wouldn't do anything to the Air Force. Honestly, the Air Force is the critical element in the conflict with China right now, and they are under-resourced for the mission they have.
Mr. Singer, anything to add?
I would just add, I think the focus shouldn't be simply on which systems, but rather the design, the organizational structure, the wire diagram.
Yeah.
Basically, we have unit designs that primarily date from between the 1940s to the 1980s, and a Pentagon and command and control structure that reflects military reforms in Prussia in the 1800s. So if you updated those, you would actually get a lot of the personnel gains that would save the money that you want, and it more reflect 21st century needs.
Thank you, and I appreciate the nuance of understanding that we'd have things to add that would be more thoughtful, and thank you for that point, Mr. Brose. Second question, I know we're running low on time, but the idea of talent, mindset, and what we need to do sort of as a whole of nation, particularly looking at cyber forces, but in general, new ways of thinking and talent. Any specific, I know that's a broad question, but any specific thoughts, recommendations there? My district, proudly home to West Point. What can we be doing at our military academies, in our, even just our schools and community colleges, to get at the cyber talent and other talent issues? With 27 seconds, sorry.
Just very briefly, I think the key talent challenge is going to be having the sufficient amount of technical talent in the government, in the Department of Defense, or advising them to be able to make informed and intelligent decisions about what is going to become, what is already becoming, a highly technical force. In terms of these types of emerging and advanced technologies in particular. You know, if you're looking at it and you can't sort of call balls and strikes and differentiate what is good from what is not, the government's going to make a lot of bad decisions. So having technical people in the room who are capable of helping the government make those decisions or make those decisions themselves, I think is key.
The gentleman's time has expired. We'll have to come back to the question of talent in the second round. Next up, a Texan, a domer, a national champion, a man who's ran 7 marathons on 7 continents in 7 days. Is that right?
When I did that, I was as skinny as Mr. Gates.
An Air Force officer, Mr. Fallon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses. Mr. Brose, in my opinion, the future of warfare is going to be defined by innovative capabilities and that we possess, and how they compete against potential adversaries' capabilities, of course. Under the auspices of the Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering, there's no less than 7 different entities, generally defined, that are responsible for innovation within the DoD. With these entities, like the Defense Advanced Research Agencies, there's some, renowned breakthroughs. But still, there's a considerable amount of wasted time and effort and taxpayer dollars, et cetera, through the notoriously bureaucratic system. It seems like every time that the good idea fairy visits the Pentagon, there's a new office born and a colonel gets his wings, kind of thing. What can we do about the duplicative offices? They're packed with bureaucrats for everything, and it comes as no surprise to me that we struggle to bridge the valley of death in a system designed like this. So through your experience, how do you think the department can best streamline the efforts to capture innovation in a timely manner moving forward?
I thank you for the question, and I think you're spot on. I would actually turn it back to this subcommittee to say, I think from my experience in government and out of government, there is a crying need for greater oversight. Exactly to your point, we're spending billions of dollars on research and development, new types of technologies, some of which are duplicative, some of which the commercial industry is already 10 years ahead on. Some have no path to making an operational difference. I think the first place that I would start is sitting down and actually going into real detail over what are we spending, what are we actually working to develop, and using the powers that this committee and this Congress has beginning to make some of the hard choices that, perhaps the department is not positioned or incentivized to make. And I think, in so doing, you can begin to start to create patterns of behavior on the executive branch where they may begin doing more of this themselves. But there's a desperate need to rationalize what we are spending and what we are doing on advanced technology and start really focusing on what are going to be the priorities that we need to get fielded fast.
Can I jump on that?
Yeah, please.
First of all, I'd bottle up whatever the Marine Corps has going on, because I'll give you two systems, and their acronyms, I apologize because I don't know them. The first is MREC, where they took an Iron Dome system, their Gator radar, and the existing all-domain command and control, and created a short-range air defense system that has eluded the U.S. Army for over a decade. And then the second is they took a naval standard missile, paired it on top of a HIMARS launcher, and got themselves a anti-ship cruise missile system that can deploy all around the first island chain. Both of those were innovations that started down at the major lieutenant colonel level and worked their way up through the system and succeeded. I mentioned earlier the Harpoon system, where the Ukrainians adapted that in 2 months. They also ran out of SA-6 missiles for their Buck launchers and grabbed our RIM-7 Sidewinders and installed them in 1 week and began shooting down Russian cruise missiles. Again, the Army's been working for 10 years on a system called IFPC, Indirect Fire Protection Capability. And it seems to me that we need to take this innovation that starts at the ground level and move that up, because that's where you save money and that's where you get real capability.
Go ahead, please.
Two specific ways that you could accomplish that, and really what you're after is that you don't want to scale innovation initiatives within the Pentagon. You want to scale them out at the edge in two very specific ways that the committee could support this. The first is one of the most successful organizational efforts at this is Task Force 59, which is a naval task force out in the Middle East that's actually working and testing with unmanned systems in cooperations with the private sector and allies. It's been a great success in the Middle East. Scale it across the regions, scale it across the services. The second type of organizational structure to get after this is some units they're basically copies of the Shark Tank model, where you're taking bottom-up ideas from junior troops and rewarding them. The 18th Airborne Corps has one. Replicate those across the force. That's where you want scale.
I give you one other one, sir. Sure. We had the Strategic Capabilities Office, our Special Capabilities Office, run by Will Roper, where he basically was read into all the SAP program, the Special Access programs for every service, and all the normal programs, and he was able to marry up systems, take peanut butter and chocolate and make a Reese's cup that we couldn't do with all those 9 standard research and development organizations you mentioned. So continuing to support that's critical.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman's time expired. Next up, the man from Massachusetts 9, whose district includes Martha's Vineyard, Nantucket, and Cape Cod, correct? Not quite Green Bay, Wisconsin, but nice nonetheless. Is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. It also includes Joint Base Cape Cod and Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute, UMass, and Dartmouth that has contracts with the Navy, undersea, and a lot of things we're talking about, the research is going on right in my district. So thank you for being here. Just looking in the mirror first, before we just look at you, I'd like, at your own fear of answering the question, Congress, continuing resolutions, our inability to deal with the regular order and appropriations, and even when we do it in the House side, it goes nowhere in the Senate. I mean, these are stumbling blocks, too, in our own project. Can you want to comment on how they're harmful, our inability to do this? I mean, with the continuing resolutions for everyone else listening here, it locks us into what we're doing yesterday, and we can't go forward. And this is going for a long time. So can you comment on how that is one more barrier that we face?
Thank you, sir, and you're spot on. Continuing resolutions and appropriations not passed on time are absolutely devastating for national defense. They're devastating for any company that is trying to actually plan and forecast what it's going to do. It's devastating for program offices that are trying to rationally spend money in efficient ways. But I would argue that They are absolutely worst of all for the kinds of non-traditional emerging technology, the builders and providers of those systems, because they don't have an enormous amount of programs of record to fall back on. All of their things are new. So if you are locked in the past, the past requirements, the past budget, you are de facto not moving these types of things forward. So while it is harmful to everyone, it is most harmful to exactly the kinds of technologies and capabilities and the people building them that I think this subcommittee is focused on and this hearing is focused on.
Great. Thank you for reinforcing that from your perspective, too. I think it's a direct impediment to what we're talking about trying to achieve here in this morning's hearing.
And if I could say just very briefly, I'm highly confident that the Chinese military is getting its money on time.
Well, given their structure. That might be one great thing. That's about maybe the only thing good about their system, perhaps. We talked about Russia and the Ukraine examples that we're learning going on, and one of them, within days of the invasion, SpaceX provided Starlink dishes to augment the country's battered internet system that was in place, and then right after that, the Russians tried to jam the system. But Starlink's response was swift and efficient. Even I think one of the DoD directors said the response was eye-watering. Again, is that an example of what we're talking about this morning, that our ability, our need to really be more agile, make determinations in the defense arena the way we often see it in the private arena?
No, I agree. First, I think the important thing to look at there is what happened beforehand, which was the Russian, people seem to think Russia didn't do anything effective in cyber. They had a fairly successful first night. They took down Viasat, took down, as you said, the internet, but more importantly, the command and control system for the Ukrainian army. If Starlink had not been put in there, they would have really struggled in that first week when you saw that lumbering line of tanks heading towards Kiev without that command and control. So that is critical. But you're absolutely right. The agility in the Starlink system says a lot about where we need to go. And I think you'll have the opportunity to really to advocate for a thick belt of low altitude constellation, a LEO constellation that can provide that kind of persistent communication support to our forces in the same way that Starlink has to the Ukrainian forces. And I do think it's critical that we talk to our allies and partners about having those contracts ahead of time, which with every private sector company, so they're ready to switch to a redundant, reliable system after an attack.
And I think as we look forward to the threats from China and Taiwan, the lessons there that are learned are going to be extremely important. So thank you for this hearing. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for having this hearing. Thank the ranking member for having this hearing, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields. Next up, another new member of the committee with a wealth of experience, a Marine pilot, helicopter pilot, a Navy commander, emergency physician, and most importantly, the proud custodian of my pull-up bar, which is now in your office, Mr. McCormick. Dr. McCormick, excuse me.
Thank you, sir. And we're enjoying that pull-up bar, which frames my desk right now. Great picture-taking availability in my office if you want to stop by sometime. I had all these great questions, and the Rear Admiral Montgomery threw me off when he said the Air Force is the key, from hurting my heart as a Marine and hearing that from a fellow Naval Force person. I'm curious, though. When we were in command and staff, we always said that we said the same thing right after World War II, that the Air Force is the key. When we're talking about this particular theater in the Chinese, Taiwan Straits and so forth, I would hope that most of us understand if we go to a full-scale war, of course, the Air Force is going to be central to our strategy and tactics. The problem is we're probably not going to be, I hope to God, we're not a full-scale war, so I don't think the Air Force will be as strategic or tactically important as maybe you're indicating, because they won't be engaged directly. In other words, we'll be relying on Taiwan deploying their own forces that we have hopefully pre-positioned, which gets back to my main point. Without disclose any classified information, how much do we have pre-positioned in Taiwan? How much capability do we have out there already ready to deploy? I love the ideas of using the low-tech, or I guess somewhat low-tech, smart mines. I think it's brilliant. Once again, command and staff talked about that, using these low-tech things to take out high-tech targets. What other kind of opportunities do we have out there as far as weapon systems that we can use at a reduced cost to take out higher cost weapon systems that take a lot more time to produce? If you'd comment on that.
So first, to answer your first question, we don't have weapons stowed in Taiwan. In the last National Defense Authorization Act, you approved the appropriation of up to you authorized up to $300 million a year to be appropriated for Taiwan-specific munitions. The appropriators, which happened about 7 days later, appropriated $0. In fact, almost all of the Taiwan Enhanced Resilience Act, which you all pushed through the NDAA, ended up not being appropriated in the Consolidated Appropriations Act that passed 8 days later. So the answer to the question is we have none there. We do have significant munitions in Guam, Japan, and elsewhere in the AOR, but we don't have them in Taiwan. I think we need to. We've been pushing for something similar to what we have, War Reserve Supply Israel, where we store munitions jointly with the Israelis and Israel for a future conflict. And we're, in fact, drawing on them for Ukraine right now. We should be doing the same thing in Taiwan.
How easy would it be for us to deploy, though, once something goes down? It doesn't seem like it'd be very, I'm not optimistic we would be able to deploy things from Guam and Israel and other places to get to Taiwan once Chinese get engaged.
100% I agree with you. Even in a blockade, which, as you mentioned, is probably more of a naval than an Air Force thing, but in a blockade or an invasion scenario, the United States is not going to be able to resupply Taiwan. So Taiwan has to have the munitions they need. And if we're somehow able to get the 12th Marine Regiment over there from Okinawa, which is a great new initiative from the Commandant, they're going to need to have, the naval strike missiles will already need to be stowed there because we're not going to be able to resupply those Marines.
I will say you redeemed yourself, sir, with the 04-05 Marine comment of being ingenuitive and the head of the Army, which I agree on also. We talked about, it's interesting, Elon Musk always talks about, I have a million ideas, it's what can be executed that matters. And you mentioned Starlight. What about the integration of the high-tech and the low-tech stuff? What's achievable as far as something, the most bang for the buck when we talk about our technologies? Not things that take years to develop, that when we have something that may happen within a year, maybe within 5 years, it's almost inevitable in this case, in my opinion. I'm worried about how fast we can deploy something, how fast we can ramp up when we start to gear up for that sort of thing. What's the best bang for the buck?
Rapidly, first, counter-drone systems. We're not talking about Photon. In fact, China's working on them as well right now. I have an article out today on it. That would provide great defense for both our allies and for U.S. forces. Second, the naval smart mine aspect, really cheap, very easy to create. I just want to answer real quickly your prior question. A key issue for the committee to explore, given the dilemma that we talked about, is logistics, supply, in contested areas. We've redesigned the Marine Corps to deploy into these areas. We haven't figured out the logistics for it. Same thing for Taiwan. So the more that you can invest in contested logistics, which is another area that doesn't require high-end solutions.
Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. Next up from New Jersey, a Rhodes Scholar with experience at USAID, the Pentagon State, and a member of the Select Committee on the Chinese Communist Party, Mr. Kim.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the three of you for joining us. Mr. Singer, I wanted to start with you. I found your testimony, your written testimony, very interesting. I also like to kind of think through scenarios and try to understand and parse that through. And I guess, when I'm thinking about what is the potential lead up to another conflict, I'm often thinking about, what is the will of the American people to be able to engage in this? What are the needs for our own protection, and how would this potential lead up to a conflict or this very intense deterrence situation affect our own security and our own protection? And so cyber is one of the places that kind of keeps me up at night because it feels like it's one of those places where when you work through the scenarios, you can see how this is a place where you could see some kind of blowback towards our homeland or towards the American people. So, I think about that in terms of, if the scenario you were raising, talking about the challenges that were incurred upon on the Chinese government, the CCP. But I worry about, using cyber as some sort of attack to be able to, create conditions for the American people that'd be difficult, whether that's coming after our grid or coming after GPS or other things like that. So I guess my question to you is to what extent does this need to be sort of an equal part of this strategy, not just in terms of thinking through how this is something that we do, whether for the defense of Taiwan or some other aspect, but hardening it here at home? And I was kind of intrigued because one of your points, if I remember correctly, was about creating digital literacy programs, for instance, that seemed like it was kind of getting at this point of like, how do we raise that foundation of awareness for the American people about this? But it feels like there's more there that we need to do on top of that. So if you can expand on that some more.
Thank you. It's a great question. Rapidly, two answers for you. The first is in terms of traditional cyber attacks. Much of the focus has been on critical infrastructure in the power grid area, not enough in the other parts of critical infrastructure, for example, water systems and the like. And as I wrote about and spoke about in the testimony, in particular, Internet of Things systems that we're currently not baking security in, that is the ability to cause physical damage through digital means. Yep. And the more that we can do on that, the more secure we'll make our nation. Second, I was part of a project working with Northern Command, where their experts identified top scenarios that concerned them in homeland threats in terms of everything from nuclear, bio threats, extremism, great power conflict. And what was interesting, in each and every scenario, it was not merely the nuclear threat. Every single time, their experts and the team that we put with them identified information operations as making it worse. And unfortunately, in the United States right now, we are not doing a great job at defending ourselves against information operations. And one of the keys that our Baltic allies have learned is what are known as cyber citizenship programs, digital literacy programs, where it's not censorship, it's training youth and members of the military to deal with the other part of the cyber threat that targets them every single day.
Yeah. No, that's a really important part, and I think that's something that can bring out a little bit more holistic approach than the way we think about it, not just in terms of our own DOD systems and things like that. But this question of deterrence requires not just capabilities, but it requires resolve. And I worry about just sort of the resolve of the American people if we start to feel squeezed, if we start to feel some of this here at home. What does that mean for our resolve abroad? One last point I want to raise is. You kind of mentioned how other countries are moving forward with other types of programs of this. You also mentioned as part of your statement about trying to make sure that we can align U.S. cyber rules and regulations with other major allies. I wanted to get a sense, does that include this idea of privacy-enhanced tech and AI? It's sort of another angle of how we look after the American people as we start to scale up.
Yes, and I think it points to a larger mentality, which is that just as much as we seek to aid other democracies, we should be learning from their best practices and trying to implement them here so that we can have cohesion. And that is an example of one area, the digital literacy, learning from what the Baltics have done successfully, et cetera, and then trying to replicate them across our allies, like in a Taiwan or whatnot.
Okay, great, thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Next up from Florida's 1st Congressional District, a humble country lawyer who represents the Blue Angels, Mr. Gates.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One of the frustrations that we've had on the Armed Services Committee has been the gestation period from R&D to actually getting these cyber capabilities to our cyber warriors. And one of the things that's been presented to us as a way to bridge that long gestation period is the Defense Innovation Unit, the DIU. I was wondering if any of you had a perspective on how we ought to think about resourcing that and whether or not that's a way to get capabilities into the hands of cyber warriors faster.
Yeah, thank you, sir. I do have a lot of experience at the DIU, both in government and out of government, and I think that it does a terrific job for what it was established to do. And there are many other organizations focused on similarly kind of reducing the barriers to entry to get these kinds of more mature, kind of commercially developed advanced capabilities into the Department of Defense. I am all in favor of that, and I think anything that you can do to encourage that is good. What I would contend is that the bigger challenge that I would recommend the committee focus on is what happens after that. So when you reduce these barriers and you bring in small companies doing small things on small contracts for small amounts of money, and you have hundreds of them, that's good. Now we need to go through and sort of systematically determine, what is the best 10% that needs to get, large-scale production contracts to really make the kind of impact at scale that you're talking about. That apparatus or process does not exist in the department, and it's something that I would say is ripe for congressional oversight.
I also, go ahead, Admiral Montgomery, if you had a perspective.
No, I agree, and I am disappointed that Mike Brown left leadership of the DIU. I think his personal leadership had a lot to do with its success. So we'll have to see what happens over time with that. Sometimes these smaller organizations can be very personality-driven.
It's good feedback. Another concern I have in the cyber sphere is the threat presented by these DJI drones. I've seen report after report from the Department of Homeland Security about the capabilities of these drones to be able to collect intelligence, to transmit intelligence, and ultimately to impair our cyber defense infrastructure. How do you think we ought to think about these DJI drones?
I'll step in there, and I'll tell you, I was sorely disappointed that the American Security Drones Act dropped out of the last National Defense Authorization Act. It makes no sense that the Department of Defense recognized that these drones are unacceptable in our system and removed them and replaced them at some cost. Yet other federal agencies, intelligence agencies and law enforcement agencies are not being compelled to follow suit. We know that these systems can communicate back to the servers of their host company in China, and we know that those companies can be compelled by the Chinese intelligence agencies to provide information. If you'd asked me as the J3 at PACOM, what would be my dream scenario when I woke up in the morning, it would be that U.S. drones were flying up and down all Chinese critical infrastructure every night and sending photos and information back to my team so that I could easily target. Well, U.S. critical infrastructure companies are buying DJI and other Chinese drones at about 80% of market share, and they're flying up and down our pipelines, our electrical power grids, our water systems, and they have the opportunity to transmit that information, and the Chinese have the intelligence has the opportunity to request it.
And oftentimes, are these DJI drones not provided to our local and state law enforcement agencies at incredibly low cost?
They are, and both Florida, as I'm sure you've experienced, in Texas, we've seen that, and in Norfolk and San Diego. And I can't imagine what a Chinese drone would detect flying in the San Diego and Norfolk areas, on a daily basis, while doing legitimate law enforcement work, but also grabbing a good picture of everyone who's at every pier.
Yeah, it is deeply frustrating to think that our own law enforcement agencies are almost being utilized, essentially being utilized by the Chinese Communist Party to engage in this activity. So, Mr. Chairman, I know you've got a lot of hats you wear on this subcommittee and also working to chair the Select Committee on China. And I would suggest that the National Defense Authorization Act would be a wonderful place to nestle some drone doctrine for defense against this Chinese capability. Appreciate the testimony. And I'm still waiting to see who in Washington is defending these drones. I don't know why that legislation dropped out of the NDAA. Maybe they'll perk up at some time.
Well, they had a pretty robust lobbying effort that used law enforcement officials, if memory serves, to go into members' office and say,
now we know better. Thank you.
I share your desire to pass the DJI ban in the next NDAA. I now recognize I already said a bunch of nice things about you when you weren't here, Ro. I drew attention
you don't have to redo it.
our op-ed when we were freshman members of Congress together, but the ranking member of the subcommittee, Mr. Khanna.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And let me just say the respect that I have for you, both as a leading thinker on how to make the Department of Defense more innovative and how to make sure we have a modern national security strategy, but also the way you've conducted this committee, reaching out to the wealth of knowledge we have on both sides. We have a really stacked committee with some of the most experienced and thoughtful people on both sides, and you've really run it in a very bipartisan way, in an idea-focused way. So I respect how you're doing it, and I'm excited to work with you in these next 2 years. Mr. Brose, I couldn't have agreed more with one of the things you said, which was we're not going to need more traditional ships, aircraft, and other platforms as much, because spending ever more money on multi-billion-dollar capabilities that China can overwhelm with multi-million-dollar weapons is a losing game. And the Moneyball military idea was certainly an interesting one to me. What, and this question is for all three of you, what can we do to overcome this valley of death? I mean, Michael Brown has talked about how now most of the innovation on the critical technologies is happening in the commercial space, not in the military space, a sort of reversal of the creation of the internet and GPS, where it was the Department of Defense innovating and then proliferating out. Now we need it adopted. The problem isn't the startups, it's often that the DoD doesn't have the budget then to acquire it, adopt it, actually use the technology. And in some cases, I was talking to Pat Gelsinger, others, the semiconductors, even though we're leading in it, China actually is adopting it faster in terms of some of the technologies. And so my question for you is, all three of you, is what do you think we need a different position under the acquisition and system task? What can we do to get the budgets and adoption faster?
Thank you very much for the question, sir. I've thought a lot about this, worked on this in government and out of government, and I guess what I would tell you is the conclusion that I've come to is that we are wildly overthinking this problem. I think that the answer basically comes down to we need to buy more of the things that we say are important and that we say are priorities. And that's the thing that doesn't happen. It's not necessarily the fault of the acquisition system. It's the entirety of the system that is not incentivized or prepared to really kind of incentivize disruption.
But just to push you a little bit on that, as the Pentagon budget's sort of 5 years in advance, right, or 4 or 5 years in advance, and a lot of these technologies are 1 to 2 year. How do we sort of structurally overcome this? So
I would say, in the next month, it seems, you will see a budget request from the Pentagon that, yes, was put into concrete somewhere between, 5 and 18 months ago. Congress has the budget authority to determine what is actually going to be bought, what are actually going to be the funded priorities of the Department of Defense. You have the ability to readjust that, consistent with laws and other things that obviously you need to abide by. I would say that the technology is there. The authorities exist. They don't need to be recreated or built anew. We're spending over $800 billion a year on defense. And billions of that is being reprogrammed with congressional approval in the year of execution. I think many of the capabilities that I talk about in my testimony that we're talking about here today don't actually cost a lot of money in the broader scheme of things. They do need to cost more money than we are currently spending on them. But they're also quite mature technologies that are ready to be bought at scale. And if we start buying them at scale, they're going to get better faster. You're going to see the kinds of companies that are building them become more capable. You're going to see others rush in and investment behind it to do more and encourage more of this activity. My basic contention, I guess, sir, is our system, unfortunately, looks too much like China at its worst and not enough like America at its best in terms of really getting capitalism and market creation into this part of the department where it actually can exist. You're not going to have markets for aircraft carriers. You can absolutely have them for AI-enabled weapons, ubiquitous sensors, and distributed space constellations.
Mr. Montgomery, did you have, I know my time's.
Yeah, a quick thought is I agree completely with the oversight comment. I'll give you one quick example. The Air Force innovated and figured out, hey, we need to put this LRASM missile on the B-52 is a quick software change. Congress authorized it 4 years ago, and it hasn't taken hold. I don't think Congress comes back enough to Congress and says, to the services and says, hey, we innovated something together, we approved it, we paid for it, we began to pay for it, and we haven't seen it come out. And it's because it competed against what the Air Force really cared about, an engine remodel, an engine upgrade of the B-52.
Gentleman's time has expired. On your comment, Mr. Brose, Bill Greenwald has persuasively written about how DoD looks too communist at times in its system. Next up, another great new member of the committee from Alabama. Am I sort of contractually obligated to say Roll Tide whenever I say that, or how does that work?
I've got 2 children at the Auburn University.
Oh, there you
so
go.
Better
Wow.
stay away, but we've got 2 great universities there, no doubt.
Mr. Strong, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And first of all, members, I'm honored to serve on this committee with each of you. I believe each of us offer a skill set that's going to be very beneficial in the days ahead, just from the geographic regions that we come from. We've heard many times about the Valley of Death, drawn out procurement processes and contract protest over that often delays critical technology from getting in the hands of the U.S. warfighter. My question is how do you believe the Department of Defense and military services should balance RDT and E funding versus procurement?
Thank you, sir. I would say that there's a time and a place for each. I think that a lot of the types of capabilities that we're talking about today can be shifted to procurement. It is possible to have the department buy more of these kinds of capabilities and actually push the burden for research and development more onto private industry so that they can develop these technologies at the pace that they're actually capable of being developed at. RDT&E, I think, is more useful when we're talking about technologies that are further out, where there's not, kind of commercial drive to, to really kind of put that investment in and develop those technologies. Those are the kinds of things that I would contend, RDT&E really needs to be focused on. I would say that many of the things that we're talking about here, we need to think about through a production and procurement lens, not a research and development or science and technology lens. Because if they're thought of that way, they'll forever stay science projects, they'll forever stay in the laboratory, they won't transition, they won't get fielded, they won't make an operational impact.
Yes, sir. Ms. Singer.
To build on that and actually to answer Representative Khanna's question as well, the only way that you get change is not merely through bureaucratic reform, it's through successful use cases. And you get either successful use cases of the new in wars, like what we're learning out of Ukraine, that's how you push past inertia, but you don't want to have that experience, or you get them through your own war games, experiments, task forces, and field uses. And one of the most important things that a committee like this can do is to be very blunt and direct. Every year in the budget cycle, the Pentagon comes in with a request, and then after the fact, Congress jams in a couple more procurement of some single system that's not going to win or lose a war. That same amount that you spend on that additional beyond Pentagon request single system, if it was spent on war gaming, task forces, some of the things that we've talked about here to get successful use cases, that would actually help potentially win a war.
Thank you. My home is Huntsville, Alabama, also known as Rocket City, USA. It's a hub of innovation. You think about it, satellites, drones, missiles, counterintelligence. We've got a little bit of all of it. What are the biggest challenges you see facing new companies and startups when trying to work with the Department of Defense? And what I mean by that is these new companies have some of the brightest ideas, the up-and-comers, very unique employees that may be directly out of college. And what I'm trying to do is how can we work that better with the Department of Defense?
I'll give you one quick one and then turn it to Chris. One of the biggest problems they face when a startup company comes to this is that their runway for beginning to get investment from a customer is 18 to 24 months. And the Department of Defense's runway, for their laborious plane to take off is about 4 years. And somewhere in that point from 18 to 24 months to 4 years, they have to sell their intellectual property to a prime, which then begins to reimagine it into something they already have. And to me, that destroys a lot of the innovative intellectual thought and entrepreneurial thought that goes on in our small companies. So figuring out how to shorten that runway to that first procurement being at 18 to 24 months.
I would go back to many of the things that I've said about the need to buy at scale faster the capabilities that are best and that are working. But I'll give you one sort of very concrete example. A challenge for a lot of these companies that are brand new is they don't even have access to the problem because it's classified, and you say, well, how am I going to be able to get access to the problem? Well, you need a classified contract. Well, how am I going to classified contract? Well, you need security clearances. Well, how do I get security clearance? Well, I need a classified contract. It's a catch-22. So when my last day as the staff director of the Senate Armed Services Committee, I was a TSSCI Q SAP super user. The day I left, I was essentially a new immigrant from Beijing. We have thousands of people who are leaving military, government, intelligence service every year who could be helping these kinds of companies understand the problem and create better synergies with the government, and we're just like leaving all of that value on the table.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming before us today.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. All of you, in one way or another today, have made a compelling case that certain new technologies are changing the character of war, though the nature of war endures. What are some lessons from wars past that we would do well to remember, that might caution us against what I would call magical third offset thinking about technology? Just basic lessons about the past of war that are still relevant today, starting with Mr. Brose.
Indulging my inner historian. I think there's an interesting experience that you can look at from sort of the middle of the 19th century to the onset of World War I, World War II. The types of technologies that showed up on the battlefields in 1914 were visible as far back in some form or another as the American Civil War, wars of German unification, the Boer War, all of these conflicts of the second half of the 19th century. It's that people weren't paying attention to how they were actually changing the character of war, to your point, which is why the beginning of 1914, the war was so bloody, was because we were using new technologies with old doctrine. That completely changed over the 4 years of that conflict. It changed the nature of defense and offense, where the ability to kill in large numbers had grown considerably, but troops were still walking across the battlefield the way the Roman legions did. So there was a sense that, defense was now preponderant. The onset of the internal combustion engine, 10 years later, completely changed that. So I guess it's a lesson to say the things that we think are in the future are happening now. But the lessons that we derive from what's happening now, it can change very quickly with new technologies or the utilization of new technologies that we might not be able to see, but are coming. So it's just to say, learn the lessons of today so that we can be ready for tomorrow, but be ready for surprise because it's coming.
Mr. Montgomery, and keep in mind I only have 2 minutes and 50
Yep, and I'll keep this to 1 minute then. So you tend to think in World War II in the U.S. Navy that, well, we failed to understand the emergence of the carrier, and that's certainly an important element in our concentration on the battleship. It was inappropriate and cost us a year's worth of production. It cost us 1942 in the war in the Pacific. But I also remember the most important thing we did was at the Naval War College, we executed Plan Orange and Plan Black wargaming for 8 years straight with, Commander King and Captain Nimitz and Admiral Leahy, our future leaders executing different various war plans till we understood what was likely to succeed in an expansive campaign with Japan in the Pacific. That kind of wargaming is critical. I think it's important for the military to do it. I'd also recommend that congressional committees get involved more in wargaming, go observe these events so they get a better understanding of what the risk and consequences are of decisions they're making in their budgets and their NDA authorizations.
Thank you. We used to have, as my understanding, organic wargaming capability in Congress that was housed at NDU but was subject to us. Mr. Singer.
Rapidly, 3 lessons from history. First, as a blitzkrieg, and then I think all of these are parallels from the 1920s and 30s. One, as the blitzkrieg showed, it's not how many of the new technology you have, even how good it is. It's actually your doctrine for bringing it all together. The Germans didn't have the most tanks. They arguably didn't have the best tanks, but they had the best doctrine for bringing it all together. I don't think we've talked about or thought about enough of the new doctrines for the U.S. military using these technologies. Second, there's no such thing as truly first mover advantage. Very parallel to us, the British, they invent the aircraft carrier, they invent the tank, but they lock into the early designs of it, they lock into the first uses of it. We, as an innovative military, need to be very, very careful not to lock in. And then third, those war games of the U.S. Navy's doing in the 1930s and 40s, the successes during the Pacific, all comes out of personnel reforms during the 1910s. And so again, Trent Hone's book, Learning War, is a great example of that. So for all the discussion of changing technology, it's also about your human talent management. If you're not making any changes there, you're not going to win.
Thank you. I'm almost out of time, but I'm the chairman, and so I'm going to entertain a second round of questions, if you're all interested in a second round of questions. And so I'm going to recognize myself for 5 more minutes. It's nice. Mr. Brose, in your testimony in response to various questions, I think you see everyone's interested in this valley of death problem. We've been talking about it endlessly. For some reason, we can't kill the valley of death. You said, we're overthinking it. We just need to buy, the Pentagon needs to buy more of the things it needs, right? So what, in just like the simplest terms possible, if we, as you say in your testimony, have given the Pentagon all the authority they need, all sorts of OTAs and this and that, what then is the problem? Why, is it just a lack of SecDef, maybe that's sort of an acronym, Secretary of Defense, prioritization of certain things? What's standing in the way of us buying more LRASMs or take your pick of preferred weapons system?
I think it's a failure of imagination. I think what we're talking about is disruption, and disruption is a cognitively challenging experience. You know, when you have an organization that has been set up for a very long time in terms of the ideas at its core, the conception of military power that it has, the types of programs that it's fielding, obviously all of the kind of outside apparatus, industrial and otherwise, that is geared to produce it, it's very hard to get disruption. You know, when you look at disruption in the commercial sector, most of those stories don't end well. They end with the incumbent going out of business and the disruptor getting to scale and becoming successful. I think in the defense sector, innovation and disruption doesn't just happen because it's not rewarded, because there aren't incentives for it. I think those incentives need to be created in a way that haven't been created. It's going to be challenging, but I think we have to be capable, first and foremost, of imagining, and I think this is your point, what are the kinds of ways in which we are going to have to fight, and what are the kinds of capabilities that are going to enable us to do so, not in the distant future, but potentially in this decade, and what are the things that we can have. I think we need to make this problem much clearer. So often innovation gets talked about in this very kind of ephemeral way, and we need to get brutally precise about the kinds of innovations we actually need to move the needle on deterrence. And I think the war in Ukraine is providing a lot of opportunity to both see what those disruptions look like, because they're literally on the battlefield now. And I think there's creating a sense of urgency about the things we need to do to really kind of buy that at scale.
But to your point, and forgive me for being obtuse, if the Secretary of Defense wants to stockpile a bunch of switchblades, a bunch of LRASMs, a bunch of harpoons, and surge them west of the international date line, he could do it. Right?
He has the authority to do it. He has plenty of money in the annual reprogramming process, so put aside the budget. I believe the Secretary of Defense is authorized to reprogram upwards of 3 or 4% of the defense budget, which it doesn't sound like a lot, but 3% of $800 billion is quite a lot. Can buy a lot of loitering munitions or LRASMs or what have you. I think the challenge is you actually have to start doing that. As I think we've seen in the war in Ukraine, even things like tactical weapons don't just materialize overnight. You need to get the industrial base moving. You need to get facilitization and investment happening so that you're on a war footing from an industrial base perspective, both in terms of things that you're going to need that you have already, as well as things from loitering munitions or autonomous systems in every domain, small satellites and the like, that are absolutely possible to have in large numbers in the next few years if we make the investment. Secretary has the authority. He certainly has the money. Congress does as well. It's a question of saying...
Technology exists. It's not...
Yeah, again, we're not talking about cloaking devices here. We're talking about things that are literally being used on the battlefield in Ukraine, or things that could be rapidly matured to meet different operational needs on a quick timeline. I think we need to get, Admiral Montgomery kind of hit this well. We need to dispense with the idea The kinds of things that we're talking about take 15 years to get through the development process. Again, we're not talking about a nuclear submarine here. We're talking about things that should be viewed as essentially consumable items. We're going to buy them in large numbers. We're going to use them or consume them in a period of 18, 24 months. And then we're going to buy new, better versions of them. And I would say that a crazy thing happens in a capitalist society when you buy new things often. More people want to build them. The technology gets better.
I guess what this is making me think is maybe we don't have a structural problem or authorities problem. We have a sort of a cultural problem in DoD, in the acquisition sort of workforce. We'll have to come back to that because I'm out of time, and I have to abide by my own commandments. Mr. Ryan is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Appreciate the bonus round here, and thank you again to our witnesses. I want to build, Mr. Singer, on something you said in your last answer about personnel reform. And going back, I'd kind of asked us to think about the cyber force, specifically broadening beyond just sort of our kind of conventional sense of talent development. How do we look across the country more creatively? Looking at earlier STEM education and ideas like that. Are there any lessons, again, from history that you've seen that in other conflicts that we could apply to think about really broadening that base of cyber talent across the country?
Thank you. I think a couple of tangible things that we could do beyond the obvious issues that America has within STEM education. The first is we could create a version of a cyber reserve or a cyber auxiliary, where there is a gap between what the private sector is able to provide and what the formal National Guard and Reserve is. What we're talking about here is something modeled roughly after the Civil Air Patrol or the Coast Guard Auxiliary, successful models in the air domain and in the maritime domain. We don't have a version of that for the cyber domain, where it's both able to aid in education, draw kids in, but also serve as an auxiliary at points of crisis. We did a report at New America about this, and its rough costs would be approximately $25 million for something that one major cyber incident, if it stops, would pay for itself. The second, within the military, is that we still have a problem of basically drawing people into cyber forces, and actually hit some of the things that the Admiral spoke about. When you go to the academies, their top talent, including people with incredible digital expertise, and then you ask them, what are you going to go into? It's very rarely, oh, I'm going to go into 10th Fleet, or I'm going to go into Cyber National Mission Force, et cetera, even though that's arguably the most active part of the U.S. military right now in its day-to-day contestation with our foes. So there's kind of a issue of, and a longer conversation of how to get the best talent within the military to want to join cyber organizations.
Please, yes.
I'll jump in on that, and I'll differentiate one thing. At West Point, the Army Cyber Institute actually is leading, and I go up there every year. They have between 21 and 42, depending on what the Army numbers are that year, of graduates from the course going in, and they really are the smartest kids there on cyber and computer science engineering. The other services aren't near as strong. The Naval Academy is abysmal in this, historically taking about 4 students into it from the class, and obviously they need to adjust to be more, Naval Academy needs to adjust to be more like West Point in this regard. I'll give you one other one, the Scholarship for Service program inside the government. So non-humbly, I'll say I created 23 years ago. It has about 500 graduates a year right now going into federal service. It's at 92 universities and colleges. We need to expand that to about 1,000 graduates a year. It's modeled on ROTC, the way I was commissioned, and it pays for room, board, and tuition. So I would definitely continue to fund that. And there's a DoD version of it called Cybersecurity Scholarship Program that uniquely gives 100 students a year to the Department of Defense, and I would expand that, as I look forward to these things.
Thank you. I apologize, Mr. Burrows. I just want to bring up one other quick point. And hearing West Point beating Navy just warms my heart. So thank you for saying that on the record. Mr. Singer, I know we don't have time, but can you point me towards the direction of any writing or thinking on sort of your idea of fiction intel around ChatGPT specifically and some of the newer, I know I sound like a Luddite, but I mean, seeing it myself now is just really almost paralyzing to think about the implications. Anything that you've written or others that you could point us towards on that?
There's one scenario that we did looking at potential Chinese use of it. Happy to engage with you further, but more broadly, that's the only one that I'm aware of, and it points to a larger agenda that if we think this is a key new technology area, let's game out, let's envision what is both our potential use of it, but also adversary potential use of it, so it doesn't hit what both Mr. Brose, but also the 9/11 Commission described as a failure of imagination. Yeah. It's easy to solve that failure of imagination.
Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Khanna.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have two questions. One, following up on the chair's point about how we overcome this adoption issue, other than imagination and talking to the Secretary of Defense and trying to change the culture, what specifically can the committee do? I mean, are there any legislative recommendations? I mean, hard to change the culture. I mean, the committee can talk to people, but what specifically legislatively can we do? And then the second question is, do you think there's any value in having the DOD have its own venture fund like In-Q-Tel, where they're actually taking a stake in the company? And maybe just start with Mr. Singer, and as much time as we have, if you could keep your remarks about a minute.
So if we look at successful cases where an innovation has made it across the valley of death, like for example, the Predator drone, it doesn't happen merely because of top down. It happens because you create demand within the system. You give members of the services a taste of it, an experience with it, and then they say, we want more of this. So the more that you can fund, not merely creating the system, go out and buy it, the more you can fund programs designed to draw those technologies in. I earlier referenced, for example, we have a task force in the Middle East for naval drones. Why is it not across multiple different services, across multiple different commands? Same thing, we've got a couple of fleet problem exercise type models, but not replicated. The more that you can replicate that across the system, give people experience at it, then you're gonna create that demand force within the military culture.
I'll give you two quick ideas. You have 3 posture hearings coming up next with Department of Defense officials. I put them on the record to come back to you with ideas for how they can push it, specific initiatives that they have or are willing to do over the next 2 years. The embarrassment of coming back the next year with an empty folder should be enough to drive some of that change. And to answer your other question, I do think the department should have a venture capital kiddie fund. Chris Brose and Chris worked on that hard when he was on the Senate Armed Services Committee. We didn't get it across the finish line, and I'm a little worried. What I saw them announce so far sounds like a venture capital fund without capital, and that worries me a little bit.
Sorry. I would actually say, you know, the many powers that Congress has, I would sort of put legislation to the side, and I would say oversight and funding are the most important. So the Predator drone is an illustrative example. It began as a congressional earmark. If left to its own devices, the United States Air Force still would not be flying remotely piloted aircraft. The Congress had to force them to adopt a capability that was disruptive and contrary to the culture of the service. I'm not saying that, you guys should go wild with earmarks. I am saying that the power of actually funding different kinds of military capabilities is the power of this committee. It is the power of the Congress. That is something that I think can be exercised. And I think with that is the oversight to say, why aren't you buying these kinds of capabilities? Why aren't you scaling these things that work? And getting down into those details where you can call balls and strikes, I think is wildly important. The final piece on the Capitol, I would argue that DOD should not become a venture capital arm. There is plenty of money in private capital markets to fund worthwhile companies doing worthwhile defense work. The thing that the DOD uniquely has that it doesn't use is its sole power for demanding and buying disruptive capability. That's how it sends a signal to the market in terms of what it values. If it does that more and it does that at larger scale, That's how it's identifying what winning looks like, what right looks like, the kinds of things that it wants more of. I would argue capital will flow into the companies and the places that are providing those capabilities if the department, in this monopsonistic, world of national defense, does what it needs to do, which is demand and buy it in the first place.
Great. I'm now going to move to a third round of questions and recognize myself for 5 minutes. One thing your question, Mr. Khanna, makes me think is whether, and Mr. Montgomery's answer is whether we need to think through like a periodic, in my head I think of as like an other transaction authority Thunderdome, where we put the services on the record in terms of how and why they have or have not used the authorities that we've given them. Quickly, I want to amend slightly something I said earlier when Mr. Brose and I were talking. It seems based on your testimony that we don't lack authorities, we don't lack money, we lack leadership willing to take intelligent risks when it comes to buying certain things. Is that accurate?
I think it's partly accurate. I think part of the challenge is integration doesn't just happen at the Department of Defense.
Yeah.
We have this incredibly fragmented accountability from requirements, definition, programming and budgeting, acquiring. That integration sort of resides at the senior leadership level. I think the challenge is not simply that those people are unwilling to take risk. I actually think they're incredibly willing to take risk. And in my conversations with all of you and other members of the Congress, I think there's an enormous appetite to take risk. The challenge is, how do we identify the right risks to take? How is timely information being surfaced such that whether it's the Secretary of Defense or a member of Congress can say, I will bear the risk and be accountable for doing something that, if left to its own devices, the bureaucracy is not incentivized to do and deems too risk-worthy. That, I think, is the real challenge here, which is the ability to gain, kind of an appropriate signal or information of what is working, what innovations are, promising, what capabilities are there, or companies that are doing good work, and pull those up to real scale with the authority that the Congress and the senior leadership of the department have.
Mr. Admiral Montgomery, so let's say the Secretary of Defense comes to you and says, hey, you've persuaded me on this LRASM issue, long-range anti-ship missile. I violated commandment number 3, I'm sorry. How do you fix it?
Well, the good news is the very first step was taken by the Congress in the last National Defense Authorization Act. You added in extra money to specific targeted defense industrial base companies to increase their ability to produce more weapons. In other words, what had happened with LRASM
was it appropriated?
It was, yes, it was appropriated. That's one of the only things that you did in this area that was appropriated. And so what we now have to do is increase, the companies have to put in their money too. And so what we need to do is get like the maximum production capability of LRASM, to use the acronym, up to about 250 a year, so we can have this problem solved within 5 years. You'll then have to ramp up production there, so you'll have to put money into the procurement of it. And as I mentioned, you need to then kick the Air Force and the Navy in the backside to get the B-52 and the P-8 ready to launch the weapons, because once you have more of these weapons, you need to have more launch vehicles for them. So that's a 3-step process. The Congress took the first step. We'll see on March 9th whether the department took the second step and increased actual LRASM production.
Well, Mr. Brose, maybe you can answer this. I know you want to say something. What about, the stuff in the weapon, the energetics? Do we have an opportunity? We're using technology that was made in 1941. The Chinese are using our technology that was made in 1984, CL-20, which has like 30% more penetrating power, longer range. Can we leverage that to take a quantum leap in certain weapon systems?
Yeah, I think everything that we're saying about the long-range anti-ship missile is true of many of our other critical munitions, all of which we're going to need more of, to say nothing of future things we could develop. The only thing I would add is we have to do this as a function of time. It's not enough to buy more in 1 year, because the signal to industry is that if you're not going to continue to do this, the maker of that particular weapon doesn't feel the incentive to put a bunch of capital at risk to build more facilities, hire more workers, if the fear is that next year the government is going to change its mind. So I know there's a debate about multi-year procurement for weapons and other strategic capabilities. I think that's exactly the right kind of direction for the Congress to go. So you start signaling the incentive that you're going to do this over time. Industry will respond in terms of capacity, but also the kinds of innovations you're talking about.
Good news is you also authorized that you were doing it already. The DoD asked you to do it for Russia-based javelins and Stingers. The Congress actually added in LRASM, SM-6, and others into the last National Defense Authorization Act. So it's authorized. We'll see if the department takes advantage of it in the fiscal year 24 budget.
There's no debate that we need multi-year authority for procuring munitions. It's just there are certain people that don't like that. Mr. Khanna, I'm really sorry. I have to ask one more question. So I'm going to entertain a fourth round.
You can have my time for a third round.
You're a good man. You're a good man. You can open the present while I'm asking if you'd like. Your wife's going to like it. That's true. We should have invited her. I'm sure this is exactly how she wants to spend her birthday, right? Mr. Singer, I really enjoyed your testimony and the way in which you teased us out through a fictional futuristic scenario that's told from the perspective of a PLA general, right? In doing that and going through that thought process, how would you describe the PLA's critical vulnerability? What do you think its true weak points are? Because one of the big questions we have is can they fight? I mean, they look tough on paper, but until you actually fight, it's hard to know whether you can fight, and they haven't fought a war in a long time. So I'm just curious what you learned in doing this exercise.
Thank you. And this actually reflects not just that exercise, but I help run a series that may be of benefit to you in this committee and the other called the China Intelligence, which pulls open source intelligence on Chinese military technology and personnel issues. So a couple of issues that they have problems with, and they know that they have problems with. One is, as we've talked about, is the personnel issue. They have a particular issue at recruiting from their highly educated and retaining. And it's not just at the NCO Corps part, which they lack, but it's also at the officer side. A second issue that they have is by the very nature of their political system, highly centralized. And it's not yet clear whether that's the best model for AI and utilizing it across networks. And we could have a longer discussion. That's what I was talking about. And one of the things that you can bureaucratically, help push for bureaucratically is a federated data, it's called a data mesh model for the Pentagon, which is what the CDAO is working on. They probably could not do that within their system because it relies on trusting different parts to act. Another key problem for them is politicization of their military. It is not a national military. It's a party military, CCP. And so that has created different kind of tribes, so to speak, within their system of who's beholden to which political leader and the like. That's also why they've had sort of a recent set of purges, corruption purges. So those are some of the vulnerabilities. I think to flip your question is to ask what are advantages, unique advantages that we have, and how can we bolster those? So what is it that a PLA officer would say, gosh, I wish I could have in my system, but I can't implement the way that the Americans can?
Would sort of decentralized command, mission tactics be one of our unique advantages?
Yes. Yes, and I think that applies to both the human side, but also if you're thinking about, with autonomy, that side too.
Mr. Montgomery, less than 2 minutes, maybe comment on that, as well as what we need to know about the cyber aspects of a fight over Taiwan.
So thanks. First, on the last question, I agree completely with Mr. Singer's comments. And I would just say at PACOM, when I went to sleep at night, the thing I dreamed about was a weapon that would damage Chinese C2 in war, whether it was cyber, space, or kinetic. We've got to optimize those weapons, because if we can take down their command and control system, I think when it comes down to our empowered pilots, ship commanders, non-commissioned officers versus their not empowered pilots, ship drivers, and non-commissioned officers, we'd have a big advantage. When I think about Taiwan, I don't think we're ready. In a scenario with China and Taiwan, I don't think we're ready in cyber. And really, the biggest blind spot for us is the cyber resilience of our national critical infrastructure. You know, as I said earlier, the transport, electrical power, water, financial services. I think it's highly likely that at the beginning of a crisis or contingency, the Chinese will begin to conduct cyber malicious activity around the ports of Oakland, the port around Long Beach and Los Angeles, with the train systems that go into them, to send us a strong signal that you're not going to be able to mobilize and sustain the forces like you think you can. I think that they could easily, you know, they have malware already. We admit they have malware in our electrical power systems, our water systems, our transport systems, our nuclear power generation systems. All those areas are susceptible. We really have to figure out how to prioritize our most systemically important critical infrastructure and how we work with those SICI assets in order to ensure that we have the right level of cybersecurity for a crisis or contingency with China.
Thank you. I am out of time. I want to thank all of our witnesses for their time, for their testimony. This was a really thoughtful conversation. We hope to follow up with you on a variety of fronts and hope we can continue to leverage your work as we try and solve some of the problems we identified over the next 2 years in a bipartisan fashion. So what do I say at the end of one of these? Do I like bang the gavel again? The hearing's adjourned.